Roxanne, it's right there.
Nej, nej. Pas på. Ja. Fanden. Så kan vi sgu komme forbi.
Forget all the mystery and controversy about Americans traveling to Havana. My first big shock after stepping off that chartered jet from Miami is how welcoming Havana seems. No Cuban army guards with guns at the gate, just a plain little building. No monument to Fidel Castro anywhere either. This could almost be a small rural airport in America until you step outside. This is all new to us. Lots of very anxious, very happy Cubans everywhere, their eyes searching for arriving family members, sometimes greeting relatives they've never met before. Family after family is out waiting with signs, cheering when people arrive from mostly the United States to come to Cuba or come back to Cuba to see the people they love. It's just everywhere you see, it's almost like it's a party here. And as I said before, I've never seen anything quite like it. And right on cue, Cuba's classic car show begins. As people roll up to the curb to pick up the cousins in their shiniest vintage gas-guzzling American sedans from the 1950s. Just like you'd expect. Think it's a cliche? Think it's impossible for that many 60-year-old heaps to look like they are headed out to the sock hop to still be out there? Well, wait till you're out on the road heading into the city. They are everywhere.
This is the best investment I can say. It cost $100 a day for me to hire a private guide in a country where people make about $50 a month.
Havana is the capital and dominant city of Cuba. 2 million people, 500 years old, lots of fascinating neighborhoods. It's easy to pick up local information, it's easy to read your guidebooks, it's easy to hop in a cab, put those sites in a row, and check them off.
Havana is well worth 5 days. It just keeps you busy. You got this romantic Malecon, the breakwater and waves crashing over it. You've got the harbor channel that is a narrow spit of water that is protected with cannons from the fortress here, and Havana on the other side. And this little spit of water takes you to a very easy to defend basin, which is the harbor. The way I understand it, this was the great harbor of the Caribbean. Twice a year, all the European trading ships would gather here in the harbor and then would go over in a safety in numbers convoy to be free from the pirates to go over to Europe with all their goods from the Caribbean. And Havana was a big deal. This is a 500-year-old city with a great history and lots to see. Havana has many different neighborhoods, and frankly it's kind of confusing. It's a big sprawling city and I didn't have much bearing on anything, and after a couple of days you really get comfortable, but you need to do your studying in advance. Havana Vieja is the very dolled up, very touristy, very front door, very relatively expensive and almost kind of garish, is that the word, tourism. In a land of such egalitarianism and such relative poverty, here you got people spending a fortune, and you got all the mojitos and all the music and all the clubs and all the beautiful newly cobbled plazas and pedestrian lanes. For an American traveler, for a European traveler, this is the comfortable quarter. This is where most people understandably hang out. I would say enjoy it, but remember, it can be mesmerizing to the point where you don't reach out and get into reality. There is lots to see and do in Cuba.
In Havana, apart from all your conventional sightseeing and important museums and so on, the real beauty of the city is simply getting out there and experiencing that slice of life. Wander through the barrios, meet the people, enjoy the architecture, and remember, when you connect with the people in Havana, that's what gives you the most vivid memories.
Cuba is that wonderful love of life in the streets. One of the big sights, surprising to me, was the cemetery. They've got the Christopher Columbus Cemetery, which is supposed to be the biggest cemetery in this hemisphere, and quite an amazing place to wander through. Well, one touristy lane called Hamal, and when you go there, you've got the dancers and the Cuban, Afro-Cuban culture going on. A huge market hall down on the harbor front was there to sell all sorts of simple art and souvenirs for tourists that are there. Very touristy, very fun, very easy. I liked it. When you go to Cuba, one of the delights are these cars. You've got these classic American cars. Remember, the embargo kicked in about 1960. So there's no cars from the United States brought in after that. It's just a time warp. And anybody who's got one of these cars now dolls it up and they rent it out to tourists. And everywhere you go, you've got guys with their old 1950s era Chevys, convertibles, wanting you to hop in. I got to play the little horns that do, 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 and everything is just jerry-rigged so it still works, and the roads are full of potholes, and none of the cars have their original engines. They're all very proud of their cars. But time and time again, we would just flag down a car, hop in, and the guy in the car taxis to get around. It's a big city. If you get into a big American classic car, this is a more aggressive guy, and he'll charge you $10 to $20 for a ride. Not cheap. You can bargain a little bit, but he knows that we're rich and we'll pay for this because we're in Cuba for 2 days and we want to ride in these great cars. If you want to get around without the aggressive cabbie, you just hop in one of these guys. And just when you get out of the seat, be careful the springs don't rip your pants. We could pack 4 of us into this and get around very cheap. And when you want to have a taxi that's just with you for 3 hours, these are the guys that are not going to rip you off. So if you're getting somewhere, flag them down, and you can do pretty well. We also just went on a whole montage of fun different ways to get around. They have bicycle, pedicabs that are just a lot of fun. They got these things called cocoa taxis, like a coconut on wheels. Local people never ride in these because they've seen too many of them just all tangled up in the roadside, after an accident. But it's a hoot for a tourist for a couple of times. They're just big enough to fit 3 big Western travelers in the back seat. And then you go for a little putt-putt ride around town, and that's just kind of fun. When that Malecon I told you about is the big breakwater, and whenever there's a chop, any kind of a surf, it's going to be splashing over that, and all of these precious old 1950s era cars don't want to be near the salt spray. In fact, they close the Malecon entirely, routinely, when there's any kind of waves, and then people have to go congesting all the inner, smaller lanes, and that must be a problem for Havana when it comes. To traffic.
A big part of visiting Cuba is checking out its revolutionary heritage. Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries came over on a little boat in 1956. By 1960, he was with 1 million people in the square declaring Cuba is free, Cuba Libre. There's lots of sites that give you that Castro take on that exciting time.
I'm fascinated by the whole revolutionary story. And when you go to Havana, you'll be able to go to the great museum that talks about the revolution. And here you get the whole thing from Fidel's perspective. Remember, it's not a free society, it's a dictatorship. And when you go to the museum, everything is going to be twisted with that narrative. And I enjoy that. I mean, we have our narrative. I mean, if you go to Pearl Harbor, you're certainly going to get an American narrative. And we just got to be honest about that. I want to stress, you need to know a little bit about the sweep of the history to understand all of this in the right context. And like any Latin American country, Cuba had a 500-year relationship with Europe in a colonial kind of way. And in the 20th century, before Castro, you had Batista, and you had this dictatorship, very friendly to American interests and big corporations owning much of the economy of the country. And of course, that meant the peasantry was kept down, and that was the people that Fidel wanted to rile up. And in 1956, Fidel came over in a boat like this. This is the famous Grandma boat. And these exiles that were in Mexico, 82 of them, came over, they landed, and they kind of said, let's go. And they managed to rise the people of Cuba up and overthrow their government. And by 1959, Castro was here talking on the Revolutionary Square to millions of people, having newly taken over the country.
That's what we did on this trip, and with their help, we visited a healthcare clinic, we learned about the Afro-Cuban religions, and we checked out an organic farm.
A very aggressive approach to healthcare in Cuba, and for us to be able to talk to a doctor who happily earns $30 or $40 or $50 a month and is part of the system and loves it. You know, it was quite interesting to hear her talking about this esprit de corps that they have in their revolutionary society. We also went with our guide to see a Santeria priest. Now, when you go to Cuba, remember there's a huge slave heritage there. And you have the indigenous population, you have the European conquistador kind of population, you got the American, and you got the slave, all mixed together. The slave culture is huge. And when the slaves come over, they bring with them their indigenous religions from Africa, and then they've got the imposed Christianity on them, and in good style, like many societies do, they mix it all together. And what you got today, Santeria, that's just one of many Afro-Cuban religions that have dimensions of Christianity and lots of their African slave culture religion. And with our guide, we met this priest, and they tried to explain to us all this voodoo, animistic, whatever kind of stuff that was really pretty far out to me. And then you splice in a few crucifixes. And you have a couple of revolutionaries and a great emancipator. Now, why would you have Abe Lincoln here? Well, Abe Lincoln was the great emancipator, and this is a slave society. So Lincoln would be a huge figure in this Afro-Cuban community. The rum was like $3 for a good bottle and $5 for a great bottle, you know. And I'm interested in drug policy reform and how are you guys dealing with marijuana, all this kind of stuff. And I was talking to my friends in Cuba about this, and they said, we don't really mess with marijuana. They didn't know anybody that smoked marijuana really, and it was just not an issue. And first of all, they live in a police state, and it's illegal, so it's really pretty serious if you're going to do something flat out illegal like that. Secondly, they think of marijuana as a solitary thing that people do just to get in their own zone, and they're much more mi casa, su casa, communal, let's get together and drink some rum. They see rum as a social mixer and the marijuana as something that keeps you apart. And they said, we got the best rum in the world and it's dirt cheap, so why would we mess with pot, you see? So that's just, everybody I talked to, that was their drug of choice, is rum. And anytime you saw a party, there was just a bottle of rum. It's a $3 bottle of rum, and that's what passes around, and that makes a party. The Cuba Libre, the rum with the Coca-Cola, I've had a lot of Cuba Libres. I've never had such a good Cuba Libre as when I was in Cuba. Great rum, and I'm not a chemist about this, but the Coca-Cola apparently is made in Mexico, which uses cane sugar instead of our kind of sugar. And there is quite a striking difference. So when you go to Cuba, it'll cost you $2, but you can get a great Cuba Libre. So
percent of the population works for the state, and they're paid with something that's called the peso cubano, also known as the CUP or COUP. And the CUP really can't be used for very much. You can pay your electricity or telephone bill, you can go to a baseball game or buy some vegetables at the local market. But if you go into just about any Cuban store, you'll find that most of the products are imported, and until recently, only available in the other currency, the peso convertible, also known as the CUC or CUC, which is pegged to the dollar, so worth about 25 times more.
As far as changing money goes, and just your rudiments of eating and sleeping, first of all, when you go to Cuba, there are two currencies. There's the popular peso and the convertible peso. Be really careful, because if somebody was unscrupulous, they could pay you with popular pesos, which are worth 1/24 of a convertible peso. Now, local people live on the popular peso. Tourists, I'm not proud of the way I just completely lived on the tourist strata there. I mean, a real backpacker would have been right there with the local pesos, but I didn't have any occasion to use local pesos on our trip, we just, the convertible peso is about 1-to-1. Here you'd have the cover charge, and it's 15 CUP popular pesos, Cuban pesos, and 1 CUC for the tourists, you see? Now remember, there's 24 popular pesos in 1 CUC, so they're actually charging double the tourists there, aren't they? Which is, it's $1, so you don't worry about it. But it's just an interesting kind of thing. You've got these two levels of economy and two different strata of population. Don't try to spend your dollars. Nobody wants your dollars. It's not good for anybody to have dollars there. They just have to change it anyways. You should change your dollars into local pesos. You do that at any fancy restaurant or any fancy hotel or at any exchange desk, and it's very straightforward. I would remind you that because of the embargo, up until now, our credit cards don't work. Bring crisp new bills if you can, 20s and 50s, and bring more than you think you'll need, because
Traveling in Cuba presents some unique challenges. They've got their communist system and they're dealing with the American embargo, and that makes changing money, finding a good meal, and getting a roof over your head a little bit of a challenge. Want to remind you, they've got nowhere near the infrastructure to handle the demand of all the people are going to Cuba right now, and I'd say don't even try to find a hotel, stay in a private home, Casa Particular.
We stayed in 4 bed and breakfasts over the course of our trip. Each one was wonderful. This is the funny thing about Cuba. You don't really know what is the reality until you go there, but you hear a vibe or a buzz from different people. Oh, don't even bother with hotels. That's absolutely right. The hotels are booked up, they're charging too much, and I don't know why you'd stay in a hotel. You've got these wonderful opportunities to help a local family by paying their price, which is probably a huge price, but it's half what you'd pay in a hotel. And it's a better experience, a far better experience, and you book it on Airbnb or something like that.
Of course, you could spend months exploring Cuba, but I had 10 days and I'm happy with the way we spent them. Half of that time in Havana, the big capital city, and the rest of that time in the countryside, going over to Vinales to ride a horse through tobacco country, and then checking out Trinidad, the most delightful little 500-year-old colonial town.
When we got into Vinales, this is the bus coming in with all the people with their B&Bs, meeting people who have reservations or snaring people that don't have reservations. Almost every building in town is hired out to travelers. It's just sort of a beautiful backpacker scene. And a cool thing about these B&Bs is you get to know the host family. They're just all ready for you. I mean, it raises the stakes on how you're going to make your bed when you get home, I'll tell you. You got your swimming pool. They're thrilled to have you there, and they're even more thrilled if you'll have dinner with them. So they say, you know, for $6 each, we'll make you a nice dinner. Sure. And they're going to just go bend over backwards to make you a real feast, and you're up on their rooftops having a great home-cooked meal. And if you're lucky, you'll get a little frog that jumps into your soup bowl. Deal in Vinales, the big deal is to watch the sunset. And everybody gets in a classic car and they go up to this Batista era resort on the ridge. And it was interesting to me because I'm accustomed to watching the sun go down, but here I didn't even see the sun go down. Everybody looks at the valley and watches the light change on the valley, which is quite nice. And most tourists like us, we're going to be heading out on a horse ride through the valley the next day. This is a wonderful place to have a mojito and just enjoy the cool of the evening and imagine how fun it's going to be to explore that valley the next day where the very best cigars in the world are made. This is the tobacco country in Cuba. The next morning, we headed out to, this was something that all the tourists do, and they act like it's some big Stonehenge kind of thing. It's called the Dinosaur Wall. And I thought like it's going to be prehistoric. No, it's just some guy painted dinosaurs on the wall. So we saw that. Very nice. And then we went on our horse ride, and this was a highlight. You got to do it. Almost every tourist in Vinales is going on a horse ride, and you get you get to know your horse, and you always got a nice local guy that knows horses to make sure you're safe, and you're on your way, clip-clopping through the back lanes. And for me, what was interesting here, and I remember this kind of a déjà vu from my time in Nicaragua and El Salvador, you've got a whole economy going on off of the paved roads, off of the grid, where you've got farm communities and hamlets and little clinics and schools and shops and everything where you can't get a car. It's just horses and rutted dirt roads. I thought it was fascinating, very peaceful and laid back, and a wonderful look at beautiful Cuban society. And the economy there is big time into the tobacco. And you visit a tobacco farm, and they take you into the house and show you why the leaves are so good and how it compares to others and how they maintain the quality. And then a highlight for me was they took us into this little pavilion, and this guy took the raw leaves and rolled the most beautiful, perfect cigar right before our very eyes that I had ever seen. And here's where I really thought, I wish I had my public television crew with me, because this could be great TV. This little moment alone would almost get me back to Cuba to make a show. But he rolled it, he sealed it with honey, and then he showed us how they put it in these organic little 20 packs, just like cigarettes, 20 in a bundle, and then we got to smoke it. In the other direction, we hired a car and we went across country to Trinidad. We got to Trinidad. It's a 500-year-old town with a great, beautiful colonial heritage, a lot of history, a humble town, two-story town with a big church on the main square, and that's about the town right there. It was very hot while we were there, even in the middle of winter. It was, deep into the 80s, and also muggy. I remember going to the bus station and just interested in the whole tourism thing opening up. They had a rope actually here to keep the hustlers away from the people that they're getting off their bus. So you'd at least get off the bus and get situated, and then you walk out there and everybody's trying to take you somewhere or sell you something or get you on a horse ride or whatever. Charming, tourist-oriented cafes and restaurants in this town. Every house seemed to have a big living room like this with a room available sign on it. Casa Particulare, renting rooms. And we stayed in this place, got to know the family, a wonderful place, beautiful food, wonderful fresh squeezed juice all the time, friendly welcome every time we came in. And upstairs they had built it where everybody had their own beautiful little room with a rooftop view. Again, we got to know the family and their dog, and it just was a beautiful, intimate experience that you wouldn't get when you stay in a hotel. You pay $100 to go to the Tropicana. This is free. You buy a $2 mojito from any bar and you just enjoy the music right on that square. Every night, live music on the square in Trinidad. The guidebooks are really important. There are good guidebooks. We had Right Up to Date Moon and Right Up to Date Lonely Planet, and I'll tell you, even the most up-to-date guidebook doesn't know what's going on because it's changing so fast. You need it, but you got to cut it some slack because it's always changing. And I would not want to be a guidebook writer in Cuba because I like to be able to put something in a guidebook and know that it's going to work for my traveler the next year. In Cuba, it's just, it might work and it might not. It's just that way. You just got to be loose. In Trinidad, I needed to change money. He said there's 4 places where you can change money. I thought, good. I've got a reasonable chance that one of them will be open today with money. I mean, they may be open without money, they may be closed today, they may, be open tomorrow or yesterday, but there was 1 out of the 4 that I could actually change money. So remember, you can't rely on a place. If it says in the guidebook it's open until 6 and it's just one of them, forget it, it's dangerous. You've got to get there right now because you need a backup.
No ads on the billboards, none. I guess with no real free enterprise and no big business or industry that's not controlled by the communist government, there's no need. Mile after mile, any large sign or even mural painted on a wall either honors the revolution of 1959, immortalizes Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Jose Marti, and other Cuban heroes, or, for a change of pace, some signs brag about some government program. In fact, Cubans still hear and see a lot about how wonderful the revolution was and how great they have it now. And you might almost believe it.
A government travel agent will be glad to book you a visit to one of Cuba's beach resorts. He'll probably send you there by tourist bus. It's in a completely different part of town from the one that Cubans use. There's no line to buy a ticket, but it's 25 times the local price. On the other hand, the waiting room is clean and spacious. The toilets have attendants who hand out toilet paper, and there are doilies on every chair. The furniture is overstuffed. A television keeps you entertained. And there's even a baggage handler to help you with your gear. And if everyone looks cool and comfortable, it's because the entire place is air-conditioned. But it gets even better. The bus seats all have clean white covers, and it's only half full. The driver is told to make frequent stops so that everyone can refresh themselves with cappuccinos. Or a bottle of water that costs more than the bartender earns all day. And then it's back on board, so you can get a glimpse of the Cuban countryside before you arrive at your resort, where you will enter a completely different world. There's no traffic, the cars are modern, and the sidewalks are extraordinarily clean. The police are everywhere, not to harass you, but to make sure everything's okay. You can shop for Western brands, and then dine on beef or lobster, which only foreigners are allowed to eat. You can also rent your own scooter, unless you happen to look Cuban. Locals are not welcome in resorts like Varadero. If you want a guided tour of the whole resort, several double-deckers do the circuit every half hour. The only thing you probably won't see on board are Cubans. They're forbidden to use tourist forms of transportation, so they catch whatever ride they can. Truth be told, there's not all that much to do in Varadero, except get sunburned and shop for trinkets in the many tourist stores. Cuba's resorts are the quintessential tropical paradise, deliberately designed to keep tourists in and Cubans out. Until recently, Cubans were forbidden to stay at any of these places. Although the government badly needed those tourist dollars, it didn't want foreign ideas contaminating the local population. Cubans are now allowed to rent a room, though few can afford the $300 nightly fee. In fact, the only locals you get a glimpse of in Varadero are the bartenders and other service personnel. They have the best jobs on the island. A week's worth of tourist tips can earn them more than a doctor makes in an entire year. But they're also carefully vetted by the government for loyalty to the system, so you'll only ever hear the party line. But there's another way to see Cuba, though the Cuban government won't approve. You can hitchhike and take local buses. Stay in private homes and eat at local stalls. It's not nearly as comfortable or relaxing, but you'll get to meet a lot of Cubans. And that's worth almost anything.
And as proud as the Cubans are of the revolution, that's not what they've immortalized and dramatized for tourists in Havana. Instead, there's still this nightly ritual that actually goes back centuries at the Fort of the Three Kings, Morro Castle. You want history, America? Construction of this fort was started about 30 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. The Morro overlooks the harbor channel across from Old Havana and was erected to spot raiding pirate ships and stop them with cannon fire. But the cannons didn't end up being enough to stop the British Empire. Young Cuban men now in costume put the show on every night at the fortress. Morro fell to the British in the Battle of Havana in 1762. And even though Spain got the fort back a year later, the actors wear 18th century British uniforms during the long ceremonial firing of the cannon. It is the most elaborate display of military might, if you want to call it that, you're likely to see in Havana. And the show isn't even really about a battle. The cannon was fired at 9 o'clock every night to tell people to get inside the city walls because the gates were about to be closed.